it's Ash from Super Videos back for another video for the Walking Dead's comic book series. This is going to be my review for part 14 of Here's Negan. Just a reminder what we saw last time. So the last thing we saw in the last part 13, was basically a verbal argument between Negan and this guy that he recently met. And what the argument was about was basically this guy was hinting that Negan can use either the guy's wife or one of the women he knows and basically be with her. So it's like he was trying to use her as a prostitute in a way. And obviously, from what we know from Negan's character, he doesn't like things like that. And the last part ended with Negan just staring at this guy. And then in this issue, we pick up from where we left off. And this issue is actually one of my favorite issues. Even though nothing really happens, it's just one specific thing that happens in this issue that I'm gonna discuss, but I still like the issue. So basically what happens, Negan tells this guy where he stands on this specific situation and tells him that he doesn't like that and that he is no different than an animal, that he's no different than the monsters out there and things like that. Obviously this guy doesn't like what Negan's saying because he doesn't want Negan to think that he's in charge. So they end up getting into a heated argument. Then it gets physical. This guy pushes Negan down. He goes and grabs Lucille. Of course, Lucille is naked at the moment. She doesn't have barbed wires around her, but Negan takes Lucille, smacks this guy in the head, and ends up Lucilling this guy. So this guy is basically Negan's first Lucille victim, even though Lucille doesn't have the barbed wires around it. But it's very cool because the scenario almost matches Glenn getting his head bashed in the original comics, because we have this guy, his brain is just going everywhere and his eyeball is popping out. So it's cool how they have this symbolism, because that happened and it's like foreshadowing what's going to happen to one of our characters, even though we know what's going to happen because we saw that first. But if this happened first, it would have been like foreshadowing, so that's pretty cool. But one thing I want to mention here is when Negan falls, I think there's like barbed wires around and he cuts himself, I think, on one of those barbed wires. That could be the origin of why Negan has that cut on his chest or his body. So it's going to be very interesting to actually see if that's the case. They didn't mention anything and they kind of hinted at it, but it's going to be interesting to see whether that's actually the case. But Negan gets up after beating this guy to death. He tells everyone to get back, that he'll do the same thing to them, that they should be afraid of him. He said, "You should fear me," which is very cool because we're beginning to see that nature of Negan, so that's very cool. But that being said, he does kind of hint he might not have liked what he did, because he did mention that he crossed the line. So this Negan is still not exactly gone, but he's very close because he just murdered someone in cold blood with Lucille. So that's basically what happens, and it ends on this very cool shot of Negan holding Lucille and pointing it to someone, and he says, "You should be scared of me, you should fear me." So that's pretty cool, but it's going to be very interesting to see how this backstory ends, because there's only 2 parts left. There's only 16 parts. We're on part 14, so there's only 2 more parts left. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But I'm willing to bet that we're going to go back to where we started this whole backstory, because if you remember, we started this backstory with Negan wrapping barbed wires around Lucille. So that's obviously a flashback from where we are in the comics, but it's a flash forward, because then we flash back to seeing what happened to Negan and how he ended up being in that specific situation with him wrapping barbed wires around Lucille. And at this point right now, at the end of part 14, he still doesn't have barbed wires around Lucille, so we still need to get to that point. So I think what we're going to see happen is this backstory is going to end with Negan kneeling down in front of the fire and wrapping barbed wires around Lucille, just like how this whole backstory started. So that's going to be very interesting to see, and how it ended up getting there. Now, one more thing, when Negan fell, there was like barbed wires around. So I wonder if those are the barbed wires Negan is going to use, and if that's the barbed wires around Lucille. But it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. So a few things I want to see before this backstory ends. Now, I was a bit disappointed with the structure of the backstory and the way they went with it. But I still do think that it's a good backstory, given that we need to see a couple more things come together. So we've already seen Negan and his wife, and why Negan named his bat Lucille, because his wife's name was Lucille. We saw Negan meet Dwight for the first time and meet Sherry, basically his first wife post-apocalypse, and his first of many wives after everything went down like that. Then, obviously, things between Dwight and Negan weren't going well, so we saw that in the backstory as well. We ended up seeing, like I said, Negan and Sherry together. We ended up seeing Negan find a group of people who are going to become the Saviors. Now, the only things that are kind of left is for Negan and his group, the Saviors, or what will become the Saviors, to find the factory that's going to become the Sanctuary. So that's one. The other would be for Negan to actually be in charge, to officially be the leader of the Saviors. We're pretty close to that, but the other thing is to see Dwight's burn, or Dwight getting burned. I think that would be very cool if we actually see that as well. And maybe after everything, then we can basically get to where we were in the start of the backstory and have Negan wrap barbed wires around Lucille and end the backstory. So that's going to be very cool if all of those elements come into play and all of the pieces of the puzzle kind of come together. But that's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.